All right, today we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about the process by which a bill becomes a law. And I'm really going to drill down into the legislative process. What I want to say at the outset is that the House and the Senate have different rules for how legislation moves through the processes. But I'm going to talk today a little bit more broadly just about kind of the process in general without digging in too much into the differences and the specific nuances between those two. We'll have time to do that later on. But what I really want you to understand is while the Senate's rules go over, so they roll over every time that there's a new election and that there's a new Congress. Technically, that happens every 2 years when the House is reelected. So every 2 years, the Senate's rules don't change unless they're amended, in which case they're amended permanently. The difference with the House is that every time that there's a new House in session, so every 2 years, when the new delegates take their seats in the House of Representatives, they agree on what the rules are going to be. And the rules can dictate how easy or sometimes how difficult it is to pass legislation. So, with that huge caveat, let's walk through the process. So, the first thing that we have to understand here before we even get going is to understand that bills that become laws don't operate in the abstract. They don't come out of nowhere. Now, there's the sort of traditional lawmaking process. In that, representatives would come to Congress with ideas, policy objectives, ideologies, and they would propose legislation that would try to get those policies to move forward. By and large, in 2025, as I'm recording this, that is not how it is done anymore. Generally speaking, you're dealing with the top officials, the top House Republicans or top Senate Democrats or vice versa, whoever's in power at the time. They come together and they decide on what will be the major package for that legislative session. And that usually comes with the approval of the president, assuming that there's a unified government. And so individual lawmakers don't have as much involvement as they used to. But what I'm going to give you today is kind of the traditional overview that explains how it's supposed to function. So, in general, after a bill is proposed, it has to go to a standing committee for review. And what I mean by that is so there are all these committees that are created, and all of these committees have subcommittees, and all of these committees have members on them. A good example is what's called the Ways and Means Committee. In the Ways and Means Committee used to have control over most of the budgetary process. That's not as much the case anymore, but it used to be. And so it's really important to keep that in mind that as things change, sometimes they can actually revert back to the way that they used to be. Now, once a bill is sent to a committee, which is a really simple procedure, and by and large, bills are generally sent to committees. Even if they're proposed by the party that's not in power, you can refer a bill to a committee. And generally speaking, if that party doesn't have power, it's going to die in committee. That's what we call that. And the reason for that is that the party that is in power gets to choose how many representatives from each party sit on each committee. And so, if the Republicans, for example, are in control of the House, which they are right now, they can have a majority of seats on any given committee that they want to, which means that, no Democratic proposed legislation is actually going to move out of committee. It might have hearings, but it will not actually move out of that committee. Now, a bill can start in either chamber, in either the House or the Senate. However, there's a caveat with that. Bills that have to do with taxation or spending must begin in the House of Representatives. And that's it pursuant to the Constitution. So that gives the House the first kick at the cat when it comes to bills that deal with money. So when you think money, think House of Representatives. All right, let's talk about the committee. All right, so the committee gets a bill before it, and they're going to do a couple of things. Oftentimes, these are big committees, and they're going to refer it first to a subcommittee, so a smaller subset. So if let's say you get a bill on, let's say you get a bill on energy, okay, just a general bill on energy, but it relates mostly to oil and gas. Well, it might get referred to a subcommittee then that only discusses oil and gas related legislation. Once it has that bill in that subcommittee, the chair of that subcommittee is going to do a couple of things. The first thing they're going to do is hold a series of public comment periods or hearings. During these hearings, you might have experts come in and testify, let's say on the value of some new oil and gas drilling that's being done, or maybe arguments against it from the Environmental Protection Agency. So you're going to have experts who are going to come in and provide testimony. This is also a period when the public gets input into whether or not they like the bill or don't like the bill. And then the bill is what's called marked up. The markup process is the process by which the subcommittee changes the bill. So they may have gotten a bill that was extremely broad. And it's the goal then of the subcommittee, in conjunction with the leadership, party leadership, to decide, okay, what is the final text of this bill actually going to say? Because we want to make sure that people are on board with it. Once the subcommittee passes that proposed bill with its new marked up language, then it goes back to the committee. Then the committee votes to advance it back to the floor. The floor is the whole kit and caboodle. So it's the whole House of Representatives, all 435, or the whole Senate, all 100 of them, who are then going to vote on it. Once that happens, it can get a little bit different depending upon what's happening, but it's up to those in power to actually put the bill up for vote on the calendar. So there's another off ramp here. There's another opportunity for those in power, the Speaker of the House or the Majority Leader in the Senate, to say, well, I'm just not going to put this bill on the calendar. And if you don't put the bill on the calendar, then it's obviously not going to get voted on. So there's another way that a bill can go through committee, but then ultimately not be voted on. Voting occurs in both chambers. Now, I'm not going to talk about this too much here, but there is a quirk in the Senate that's called the filibuster. The filibuster, and we don't have a talking filibuster anymore, is a way for one senator to stop debate on a bill, and then a bill can't move forward. So most bills in the Senate get filibustered, unfortunately. That's just the reality of the situation. The only way to stop a filibuster is to vote for what we call cloture. It sounds like closure, but it's cloture. But they basically mean the same thing. Cloture ends debate on the bill. So cloture is the only way to stop a filibuster from completely derailing your proposed legislation. There's a problem, though. Cloture requires 60 votes, and neither party has gotten remotely close to 60 votes since 2008. And it seems unlikely, barring a watershed change, that will happen in the future. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means for all practical purposes, you need 60 votes in the Senate to pass legislation. Now, there's an exception here, a lot of exceptions. And the exception is a process that we call a budget reconciliation bill. So once every fiscal cycle, legislation can be passed for what's called budgetary reconciliation. And so that's what happens nowadays, folks, because it can't be filibustered, which means you need a simple majority in both houses to pass a budget reconciliation. So essentially, what we have nowadays is both parties, when they're in power, trying to cram as much stuff into a budgetary reconciliation bill as humanly possible. Now, you may be asking yourselves, well, what if they want to pass something that has nothing to do with the budget? Well, I suppose the answer is you can't, which is why both parties try as much as they can to bend over backwards to claim whatever they're putting into the budget reconciliation bill relates to the budget. Now, it's up to the parliamentarian, who's nonpartisan, to decide whether or not the provisions which are included in the budget reconciliation bill actually do pass muster and do relate to the budget enough for it to go forward. And so that's where things normally get hung up at that page. Now, as I mentioned before when I was talking about the legislature, we have a bicameral legislature, which means we have a House and we have a Senate. They both have to agree on the exact text for that bill to become law. And the way that they do that is through what's called a conference committee. So it's a committee made up of some members of the House, some members of the Senate, and they look at it and they say, okay, how can we try to negotiate to get a bill that both houses can agree on? And the only way that that works is one, they negotiate, or two, whoever passes the second one, which is if it's a budget reconciliation bill, it's going to be the Senate because it has to start in the House. Then ultimately, the House has a choice. It can pass the Senate version or it can pass nothing. And particularly recently, if we have a unified government, so same party in control of House, Senate, and the presidency, the House just settles down and passes it because they don't want the ire of the president. Now, the president, of course, can veto or sign a bill into law. If they veto it, then what happens is it goes back, and we'll talk about that in a second. But there's also what we call a pocket veto because the president only has 14 days to sign a bill. So if he doesn't sign it, then that's what we call a pocket veto. He didn't come out and formally veto it, but by taking no action, he prevented it from becoming a law. Now, let's say that Congress wants it to become a law regardless. Well, you can overcome a presidential veto with 2/3 vote in each house. That is almost impossible nowadays. But it wasn't always. And it did used to happen. But what that suggests is that if you have a bill that has overwhelming support from both parties, and for whatever reason the president vetoes it, they can't stop that forever. Now, of course, the other option would be they can take the bill back, they can revise it, and they can strike out whatever provisions the president did not agree with. And by doing that, they can make the bill more acceptable to the president. And those are the ways that ultimately, once the president signs the bill, it becomes a law.